The soft glow of candlelight flickered across the room, casting shadows on the elegant table set for 12. The hum of quiet conversation filled the upscale restaurant, the clinking of crystal glasses blending with the soft music from a distant piano. At the center of it all, Mark and Caroline sat at the head of the table, their friends raising their glasses in a toast to their 20-year anniversary. Caroline smiled politely, the kind of smile that had become second nature after years of practice. She glanced at Mark, who was in his element, leading the conversation with his usual confidence. His voice carried easily over the group, each word carefully chosen, each laugh punctuated with a glance toward her as if to remind her who held the spotlight. But Caroline noticed the subtleties others might miss. The way his grip on his wine glass tightened just a little when someone complimented her, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes when she spoke. It was always like this, the image of the perfect couple carefully curated. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered, waiting for the right moment to erupt. As the courses came and went, Caroline found herself drifting through the evening on autopilot, nodding and laughing at the appropriate moments. She had learned long ago how to navigate these dinners, these carefully orchestrated displays of success and happiness. The facade was everything to Mark, and she played her role well. When dessert arrived, a rich chocolate mousse paired with a delicate champagne, Mark stood up, raising his glass once more. The chatter around the table died down, all eyes turning to him. Caroline shifted slightly in her seat, sensing something different in his demeanor, something sharper than usual. "I'd like to make a toast," Mark began, his voice smooth but with an edge that Caroline had grown to recognize. "To 20 years of marriage." The group murmured in agreement, glasses clinking once again. And to Caroline, he continued, his smile widening, though it didn't reach his eyes. "For standing by me through it all." Caroline's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Something was coming. She could feel it. "I've been thinking a lot about our marriage lately," Mark said, his gaze sweeping the table, landing finally on her. "And I've come to a decision." The room fell silent. Caroline felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the air heavy with anticipation. "I want a divorce," Mark announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Gasps echoed around the table as their friends exchanged shocked glances. Caroline's heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained unchanged. She lifted her glass, took a sip, and met Mark's gaze with a calmness that surprised even her. The air in the room shifted, as if the very walls absorbed the weight of Mark's words. Caroline's pulse thrummed in her ears, but outwardly, she remained composed. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft murmur of shock rippling through their friends. Caroline slowly placed her glass down on the table, her movements deliberate, controlled. Her mind raced, but her body was steady. She had known this day would come. Perhaps not tonight, not like this, but she had sensed it long ago. Felt the cracks in the foundation of their marriage growing wider with each passing year. The awkward silence around the table grew unbearable, until finally one of their friends, Evelyn, cleared her throat. "Mark, surely this isn't the place." "Oh, it is," Mark interrupted, his voice loud, commanding attention once again. "It's exactly the place. I've spent too long pretending, keeping up appearances for everyone else's sake. But I'm done." Caroline glanced around the table, taking in the mix of horrified and pitying expressions on their friends' faces. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the questions they didn't dare to ask out loud. Mark leaned forward, his voice low, but still loud enough for the others to hear. "I deserve better, Caroline. We both know it." There it was, the cruelty she had been waiting for. He couldn't just leave. He needed to make sure she was humiliated, reduced to nothing in front of everyone who mattered to him. But Caroline refused to give him the satisfaction. "I see," she said softly, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil that churned inside her. She picked up her napkin, dabbing at the corners of her mouth, and then met his gaze directly. "If that's how you feel, Mark, then so be it." Her calmness unnerved him. She saw it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his lips pressed together in frustration. He had expected a scene, tears, perhaps even a plea for him to reconsider. But Caroline had no intention of giving him what he wanted. "Are you not going to say anything?" Mark pressed, his tone growing harsher. "After everything I've done for you?" The audacity of his words hit her like a wave, but Caroline remained unflinching. She could feel the eyes of their friends on her, waiting for her to break, to crumble under the weight of this very public betrayal. Instead, she smiled, a small, sad smile that spoke volumes. "There's nothing more to say," she replied. "You've made your decision, and I'll respect it." Mark's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this. The control was slipping from his grasp, and she could see it, could feel the shift in power, subtle but unmistakable. The conversation around the table stuttered back to life, awkward and fragmented. Friends murmured amongst themselves, stealing glances at Caroline, unsure of how to respond. But Caroline didn't need their sympathy. She had already decided how this would play out. As the evening wore on, Mark continued to hold court, basking in the attention his announcement had brought. But Caroline remained serene, knowing that this was only the beginning. She had played her part for too long, but tonight, she had the chance to reclaim herself. As the night drew to a close, the once vibrant atmosphere had dulled to an awkward, strained hum. Guests began excusing themselves from the table, offering hollow apologies to Caroline as they left. Some looked away, pretending not to notice the tension, while others clung to Mark's every word, eager for any tidbit of gossip. Caroline's mind was still, despite the turmoil that raged just beneath the surface. She could feel the eyes of her remaining friends on her, but she didn't flinch. After so many years of mastering the art of composure, tonight was just another performance. Except this time, she wasn't playing the role of the dutiful wife. No, tonight she was the silent strategist, her calm demeanor a weapon. As the restaurant staff began clearing away the remnants of their extravagant meal, Caroline stood. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the humiliation she had just endured. "It's been a lovely evening." There was a moment of hesitation as their friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was Mark who broke the silence, standing beside her with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Yes, yes. Thank you all for celebrating with us," he said, his voice booming as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and though the rest of the world might not have realized it yet, Caroline knew that this was the beginning of the end, not just of their marriage, but of the facade she had lived behind for years. As they exited the restaurant, stepping into the cool night air, Mark made a point of walking ahead, barely acknowledging her presence. He relished in the attention, feeding off the pity and confusion of their friends. But Caroline wasn't concerned with the show he was putting on. She knew the storm was coming. They drove home in silence, the tension thick between them. Mark didn't bother speaking, clearly satisfied with how the evening had played out. Caroline, on the other hand, was already calculating her next move. She had seen the look in his eyes, the smugness of a man who believed he had won. But he had underestimated her. As they pulled into the driveway of their lavish home, Mark stepped out of the car without waiting for her, heading inside without a word. Caroline lingered for a moment, taking in the sight of the house that had once symbolized everything they had built together. Now, it was just another part of the lie. She followed him inside, her footsteps soft against the marble floors. Mark had already disappeared into his study, likely preparing himself for another round of self-congratulation. Caroline, meanwhile, retreated to the quiet of their bedroom, where the weight of the evening finally settled on her. She closed the door behind her and stood in front of the mirror, taking a long look at herself. The image staring back at her was one she barely recognized. A woman who had lived for years under the shadow of someone else's expectations, someone else's control. But that woman was gone now. In her place stood someone new, someone who had spent years waiting for the moment to reclaim her life. The calm before the storm was ending, and soon, everything would change. The following morning, the silence between Caroline and Mark had grown colder, the tension in the house almost palpable. Mark, as usual, had left early for work without so much as a word. But this time, the silence was different. There was no apology, no awkward attempt to smooth things over. He believed the power was still in his hands. Caroline stood in the kitchen, staring at the half-empty coffee cup he had left on the counter. It was a small thing, insignificant really, but it spoke volumes about the man she had spent the last 20 years with. Mark didn't care about the little things. Not about the cup, not about her, and certainly not about the consequences of his actions the night before. She placed the cup in the sink and turned her attention to her phone, which had been buzzing with messages since early morning. As expected, the fallout from the dinner had begun. Friends, some well-meaning, others just curious, had sent a flurry of texts. Some were polite inquiries, others thinly veiled gossip. Evelyn, always the peacemaker, had sent a message offering to meet for coffee. Caroline knew what it meant. It wasn't coffee she was offering, but consolation. Caroline sighed. She had always known their social circle was fickle. Friendships built on status and appearances rarely held strong in times of crisis. She skimmed through the messages, noting the absence of support from certain individuals. Some of their mutual friends had clearly chosen sides. Mark sighed. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was from Diane, one of her oldest friends. The message was short and direct. "Let's meet. We need to talk." Diane had always been blunt, never one for pleasantries. Caroline appreciated that about her. She replied with a simple "okay" and set the phone down. By noon, she found herself sitting across from Diane in a quiet cafe, the din of city life bustling outside the window. Diane didn't waste any time with small talk. So, she began, leaning forward, her eyes sharp. "What the hell happened last night?" Caroline sipped her tea, buying herself a moment to collect her thoughts. She had anticipated this conversation, but that didn't make it any easier. "Mark announced he wanted a divorce," she said simply. Diane's brow furrowed. "In front of everyone?" Caroline nodded. "It was calculated. He wanted to humiliate me." Diane's lips pressed into a thin line. "And now half our so-called friends are probably gossiping about it." "Typical." Caroline sighed. "I expected this. I'm just surprised by how quickly they've turned." Diane crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Some people love a good scandal, and others are just cowards. But don't worry, Caroline. You've got more allies than you think." Caroline smiled faintly, appreciating Diane's support, but deep down, she knew the landscape had shifted. People like Mark thrived on public perception, and already she could feel the tide turning in his favor. The whispers, the doubt, it had all begun to creep in. But what Mark didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. "He thinks he's won," Caroline said softly, almost to herself. Diane raised an eyebrow. "And has he?" Caroline met her gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Not yet." Caroline sat at her desk, fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of an old photo frame. It was a picture from their early days, back when the smiles were real and the laughter didn't feel forced. She and Mark had been happy once. At least, she believed they had been. But as the years passed, something had shifted. He had become more controlling, more concerned with the image they projected than the life they were actually living. She sighed and set the picture down, pulling open a drawer to reveal a stack of documents she had been collecting over the years. Bank statements, emails, legal documents, all the proof she needed that Mark had been living a double life. Not only had he controlled their public image, but he had also hidden his financial manipulations and betrayals behind a mask of success. For years, she had known about the affairs, the business dealings, and the way he had lied to their friends to build himself up. Caroline had kept it all, waiting for the right moment. She didn't want revenge, at least not the way Mark thought. This wasn't about ruining him publicly. It was about reclaiming her power. If she was going to walk away, she wanted to do it on her own terms, with her dignity intact. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Another message, this time from Evelyn. Caroline hesitated, then opened it. "Mark's been telling people that you've been distant for years, that you're the one who let the marriage fall apart. I thought you should know." Caroline's breath caught, but only for a moment. She had expected this. Of course, Mark would spin the narrative to make her the villain. He needed to be seen as the wronged party, the one who had tried his best to make it work. She could almost hear him now, talking to their friends, feeding them carefully crafted lines about how he had been patient, understanding, but ultimately Caroline had changed. She put the phone down and stared at the documents again. Mark had underestimated her, but soon enough, everyone would know the truth. She wasn't just the quiet, submissive wife anymore. She had learned how to play this game. Mark arrived home late, his usual smug air of self-satisfaction trailing behind him as he strode through the front door. Caroline watched from the kitchen as he tossed his keys on the counter, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He believed he was still in control, still holding all the cards. But tonight, things were different. "Caroline," he called out, not bothering to look for her. "We need to talk." She stepped into the hallway, her expression composed, though inside, she could feel the tension mounting. "What is it?" Mark turned, his brow furrowed in frustration. "I spoke to my lawyer today. We'll be filing for divorce by the end of the week. I've had it with this charade. It's time we moved on." He crossed his arms, waiting for her reaction. In his mind, this was still a game, one he expected to win. But Caroline had spent years preparing for this moment. "I agree," she said quietly, walking over to the side table by the staircase. From a drawer, she pulled out a manila envelope and held it out to him. Mark's eyes flickered with confusion. "What's this?" "Open it." With a scowl, Mark ripped the envelope open, pulling out the neatly organized stack of papers inside. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes scanning the documents in disbelief. Then, slowly, his face turned red with anger. You already filed for divorce?" His voice trembled with rage. "When?" "3 weeks ago," Caroline replied, her voice calm, almost detached. "I wanted to make sure everything was in order before you had the chance to blindside me." Mark's hands shook as he gripped the papers. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can just walk away from this?" "I don't think, Mark," she said, meeting his gaze evenly. "I know." The silence between them grew thick, charged with the weight of years of unspoken resentment. Mark had always been the one in control, the one who dictated how things would go. But now, for the first time, he was seeing that power slip through his fingers. "You'll regret this," he snarled, tossing the papers onto the floor. "I'll make sure of it." Caroline's expression didn't waver. "Maybe," she said softly, her voice steady, "but this isn't about winning or losing. It's about taking back my life. And I've already won that battle." Mark stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Caroline stood still for a moment, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away. Then, she bent down, picked up the papers, and placed them back into the envelope. The house was quiet again, but this time, it didn't feel oppressive. It felt liberating. She knew that Mark would try to fight her, to make things as difficult as possible. But the power dynamic had shifted. For the first time in years, Caroline wasn't afraid. She wasn't angry. She was free. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, reverberating through the walls like a final declaration of war. Caroline stood in the empty hallway, her hand still holding the manila envelope with the divorce papers inside. She had anticipated Mark's outburst, expected his anger, but the calmness that had settled over her now felt surreal. This was the moment she had been preparing for, and yet it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. She walked slowly through the house, her footsteps soft against the hardwood floors, passing by rooms that had once been filled with laughter and life. Now they felt hollow, just like their marriage. For years, she had played the role of the perfect wife, keeping everything running smoothly while Mark enjoyed the spotlight. But that was over. The facade had finally crumbled, and all that was left was the raw truth of what their relationship had become. Caroline entered their bedroom, the largest room in the house, yet the one that felt the most suffocating. She moved to the large window overlooking the garden, watching as the first signs of dusk crept over the horizon. The silence in the house was heavy, but for the first time, it felt like her silence. A choice she had made, not one forced upon her. She sat on the edge of the bed, allowing the weight of the situation to settle in. Her decision had been made, and now there was no turning back. She had played her part well, but now it was time for a new role, a new chapter in her life, one where she wasn't defined by Mark's shadow. The door to the bedroom creaked open, and Mark stood there, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. He had never imagined this scenario. one where he wasn't the one pulling the strings. "So this is it?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can just end things like this?" Caroline looked at him, her expression calm but resolute. "It's already over, Mark. It has been for a long time." Mark stepped into the room, his posture rigid, trying to regain the control he felt slipping away. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone turning condescending. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied quietly, standing up to face him. "I'm taking back my life." Mark's eyes narrowed, the frustration clear in his body language. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms. But now, faced with a version of Caroline he hadn't expected, he didn't know how to react. He was losing the game he thought he was winning. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice low. "I'll make sure of it." Caroline didn't flinch. She had heard the threats before, the empty promises of revenge. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She had prepared for this moment for years, quietly collecting the pieces that would protect her. Mark could rage all he wanted, but she was no longer the woman who would be intimidated by his anger. "You're free to do whatever you think is necessary," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not playing your game anymore." Mark stared at her, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. The realization was beginning to dawn on him. He had lost control, and there was nothing he could do to change that. With a final glare, he turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him once again. But this time, the sound didn't echo with the same weight. It was just noise now, meaningless and hollow. Caroline stood in the quiet, her heart steady. She had weathered the storm, and now she was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls and meetings, as the fallout from the dinner party and the impending divorce rippled through their social circle. What had once been a close-knit group of friends was now a fractured mess of shifting loyalties and whispered conversations. Some had clearly taken Mark's side, repeating his carefully crafted narrative of a wife who had grown distant and ungrateful. But not everyone was so quick to believe him. Caroline had been quietly observing the changes, noting who reached out to offer support and who chose to remain silent. Diane had been the most vocal, refusing to accept Mark's version of events and making it clear that Caroline had her full backing. But others, like Evelyn, had grown colder, distant. The polite texts had stopped, and Caroline hadn't heard from her since the night of the dinner. Sitting in her living room, Caroline scrolled through her phone, glancing at the messages and missed calls that had accumulated over the past few days. Her social circle, once so tightly woven around Mark's influence, was unraveling before her eyes. It wasn't surprising. Mark had always been the charismatic one, the man people gravitated toward. But now that the truth was starting to seep through, some were questioning just how much they really knew him. The phone buzzed again. A new message from Diane. "Lunch tomorrow? We need to strategize." Caroline smiled faintly. Diane was always thinking ahead, always planning. She replied with a quick confirmation, grateful to have at least one ally in her corner. But as she set the phone down, her thoughts drifted to the others, the friends who had chosen Mark's side without hesitation. They had believed his lies, swallowed the narrative that he had so carefully constructed. It hurt more than she had expected. She had always known that loyalty was fickle in their social world, but seeing it play out so blatantly was another matter entirely. She stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the garden, her mind racing. The divorce proceedings were only just beginning, but the real battle was already underway. It wasn't just about legal settlements or financial divisions. It was about perception, about control of the narrative. Mark was losing his grip on that control, and Caroline knew it. He was lashing out, trying to salvage his reputation by turning people against her. But he hadn't counted on her quiet strength, on the fact that she had been preparing for this for a long time. The doorbell rang, breaking her train of thought. She walked to the door and opened it to find a courier standing there, holding an envelope. "For Mrs. Caroline Mitchell," he said. She took the envelope, her pulse quickening. Inside was a letter from Mark's lawyer, a formal notice of the divorce proceedings. It was official now. The game had truly begun. Caroline closed the door behind her, staring at the envelope in her hands. She had expected this moment, but still, The reality of it hit harder than she had anticipated. But instead of feeling fear, she felt something else: resolve. Mark may have started this, but she was determined to finish it on her terms. She had spent too long in the shadows, letting others dictate her life. Not anymore. She walked back to her desk, setting the letter aside. Tomorrow, she would meet Diane, and together they would plan their next steps. The shifting loyalties of their social circle were a reminder that this battle wasn't just about her and Mark. It was about reclaiming her place in the world, about showing everyone that she wasn't the passive, submissive wife they had assumed she was. Caroline smiled to herself. Mark had underestimated her, and now, he was about to learn just how wrong he had been. Caroline sat at her desk, her fingers tracing the edge of the manila envelope that had arrived just a few days ago. The legal notice inside was only the beginning, but Caroline knew that the real battle was just starting. She had something Mark didn't expect, something he would never see coming. The documents and information she had been quietly gathering for years lay in neat, organized folders tucked away in the drawers of her desk. Bank statements, emails, and photos. Everything that painted a different picture of Mark, one that sharply contrasted with the charming, successful image he projected to the world. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, but now that it had, she wasn't afraid to use what she had. Caroline had learned early in their marriage that Mark's charisma came with a darker side, one that only she had been privy to. The controlling behavior, the emotional manipulation. It had all started subtly, so much so that she hadn't noticed it at first. But as the years passed, it became harder to ignore, and she began to realize just how deeply Mark's need for control ran. That's when she had started documenting everything. At first, it had been a small journal entry here or a saved email there, just enough to remind herself of the truth. But as Mark's behavior worsened, her efforts became more deliberate. Every business deal he made behind her back, every affair he thought he had kept hidden, it was all there, neatly cataloged and ready to be used when the time came. And now, the time had come. Caroline opened one of the drawers and pulled out a file marked with a simple label: contingency. Inside were the most damning pieces of evidence she had collected, the ones that would turn the tide in her favor when the divorce proceedings began in earnest. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the familiar words, the cold facts that told the story of Mark's duplicity. It wasn't just about the money, though that would certainly play a role in the settlement. It was about showing the world, showing their friends, their family, and everyone who had ever been charmed by Mark, that he wasn't the man he pretended to be. He had built his entire life on lies, and now those lies were about to unravel. As she prepared to close the file, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Diane. "Ready for lunch? I'll meet you in 20. Caroline smiled. Diane had been a rock for her during these last few weeks, offering support and advice at every turn. She knew that Mark's charm had convinced many of their friends to side with him, but Diane had never been fooled. She had seen through him from the start, and now, she was helping Caroline strategize for the battle ahead. Caroline slipped the file back into the drawer and grabbed her coat. She wasn't going to reveal her hand just yet, but when the time was right, Mark would see just how much she had prepared. The conference room at the law firm was cold, its sterile atmosphere a sharp contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Caroline sat at the long, polished table, her lawyer seated beside her. Across from them, Mark sat with his own attorney, his expression smug and confident. It was clear he still believed he held the upper hand, that this was just a formality before he got what he wanted. But Caroline knew better. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, the lawyers exchanging polite but pointed words as they outlined the terms of the divorce. Mark barely glanced at her, his focus entirely on the legal jargon being discussed. He seemed bored, as if the outcome was already a foregone conclusion in his mind. "Mr. Mitchell is seeking a fair division of assets, as well as primary ownership of the family home," Mark's lawyer said, his tone firm and confident. "Given his contributions to the marriage and his financial success, we believe these terms are more than reasonable." Caroline's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, raised an eyebrow but said nothing at first. She glanced at Caroline, who gave her a subtle nod. "I think we have some counterpoints to consider before moving forward," Sarah said, her voice calm but authoritative. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder, the very same one Caroline had prepared earlier. Mark's eyes flicked toward the folder, curiosity flashing across his face. It was the first time during the meeting that he seemed even remotely interested in what was happening. Sarah began to lay out the evidence Caroline had gathered, carefully and methodically, piece by piece. Bank records showing Mark's secret accounts, the lavish gifts he had purchased for women other than his wife, and the shady business deals he had conducted without her knowledge. With each new revelation, Mark's smug expression faltered, the color slowly draining from his face. "What is this?" Mark sputtered, leaning forward in his chair. "This has nothing to do with the divorce." "Oh, it has everything to do with the divorce," Sarah replied smoothly. "You see, Mr. Mitchell, your financial infidelity is directly related to the division of assets. Not to mention the significant impact it may have on your public image, should this information become more widely known." Caroline watched as Mark's composure crumbled. He had always prided himself on his ability to control any situation, to manipulate the narrative to his advantage. But now, he was being outmaneuvered in a way he had never anticipated. For years, he had underestimated her, treated her as nothing more than a figurehead in their marriage. And now, he was paying the price. The room fell silent as Mark's lawyer scrambled to respond, but it was clear that they hadn't expected this. Caroline could see the panic in Mark's eyes, the realization that his carefully constructed life was beginning to fall apart. He had thought this would be easy, a simple division of property, a quick end to their marriage so he could move on. But Caroline had other plans. As the meeting drew to a close, Mark's lawyer requested more time to review the evidence. They would reconvene in a few days to discuss a new settlement offer, one that would no doubt be far more favorable to Caroline than the original terms. Caroline stood, her heart steady, as Mark glared at her from across the table. His arrogance had been shattered, and now, for the first time, he was beginning to see her for who she truly was. Not the passive wife he had controlled for years, but a woman who had quietly built her own strength. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the conference room, her steps light and sure. She had played her cards perfectly, and now, the final stages of this battle were beginning. The days following the settlement meeting felt like the calm before the storm. Mark had withdrawn, retreating to his office and immersing himself in work. Caroline, on the other hand, was preparing for the inevitable fallout. She knew Mark's pride had been wounded and that he wouldn't go down without a fight. But the damage had already been done. The first ripple hit 2 days later. Caroline was sipping her morning coffee when her phone buzzed with an alert from a news website. She glanced at the headline and froze. Business mogul Mark Mitchell accused of financial misconduct in pending divorce. The article detailed the very evidence she had presented in the settlement meeting, though it didn't disclose her involvement. Someone, likely from Mark's own circle, had leaked the story. Caroline felt a strange mix of satisfaction and dread as she read the article. On one hand, this was the beginning of the end for Mark's carefully crafted public image. On the other hand, she knew this would only make him more desperate. He thrived on control, and losing it publicly would push him to new extremes. As the article spread, more whispers followed. Friends who had once believed in Mark's charm were starting to question everything. The phone calls and messages started pouring in, some from people expressing shock, others from those who were quietly cutting ties. Caroline wasn't surprised. In their world, loyalty was a fragile thing, easily broken by scandal. Later that day, she met Diane for lunch. The cafe was bustling, but their table was tucked away in a quiet corner. Diane wasted no time diving into the topic at hand. "I saw the article," Diane said, leaning in. "You know this is just the beginning, right? Once the media sinks its teeth into this, they're not going to let go." Caroline nodded. "I know, but I didn't leak it. This wasn't my doing." Diane raised an eyebrow. "Maybe not directly, but someone close to him did. This is the kind of thing that happens when someone like Mark loses control. People start talking." Caroline sighed, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "He's going to try to turn this around. He's not the type to just let it happen." "I know," Diane said, her tone serious. "But that's why you need to be ready. He'll come after you next, try to drag you down with him, Caroline had already considered that. Mark would do anything to salvage his reputation, even if it meant trying to take her down in the process. But she had prepared for this. She had more than enough evidence to protect herself, and she wasn't afraid to use it if he pushed too far. "He can try," Caroline said, meeting Diane's gaze. "But I'm not going to let him win." The confrontation came sooner than Caroline expected. It was late in the evening when Mark arrived home, his face tight with anger. She had been in the kitchen, finishing up some paperwork when she heard the front door slam. His footsteps echoed through the hallway, heavy and deliberate, as he made his way toward her. Caroline turned just as Mark appeared in the doorway, his eyes blazing with fury. He held a newspaper in his hand, shaking it at her as he spoke. "Do you see this?" he snarled. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Caroline calmly set down the pen she had been holding. "I didn't leak the story, Mark. Don't lie to me," he spat. "You wanted this. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? You want to ruin me." Caroline stood her ground, her expression steady. "I didn't have to ruin you, Mark. You did that all on your own." Mark's face contorted with rage as he stepped closer, towering over her. "You think you're so clever, don't you? That you can just destroy everything I've built?" Caroline's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. "What you built was a lie, Mark. And now the truth is coming out." He slammed the newspaper down on the table, his hands trembling with fury. "You have no idea what you're doing," he growled. "If you think you can take everything from me, you're wrong. I'll fight you every step of the way." Caroline met his gaze, her voice low and calm. "I'm not trying to take everything from you. I just want what's fair. But you made this personal, Mark. You're the one who turned it into a battle." Mark's fists clenched at his sides. "You'll regret this," he whispered, his voice dangerous. "You don't know who you're dealing with." For a moment, the silence between them was suffocating. Caroline could feel the weight of the years of manipulation, the control Mark had tried to exert over her, bearing down on her like a heavy cloak. But she wasn't the same woman she had been at the start of their marriage. She had found her strength, her voice, and now she was using it. "You don't scare me anymore, Mark," she said softly. "Not like you used to." Mark recoiled slightly, as if her words had struck a nerve. For a split second, his anger faltered, replaced by something else. Fear, maybe, or disbelief that the woman standing in front of him was no longer the one he had controlled for so long. "Get out," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "I don't want to see your face." Caroline didn't hesitate. She picked up her things and walked out of the kitchen, her footsteps steady as she made her way upstairs to the bedroom. Her mind was racing, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The final confrontation had come, and she had stood her ground. As she closed the bedroom door behind her, she leaned against it for a moment, letting out a long breath. The war between her and Mark wasn't over yet, but this battle had been won. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control of her own life. The next few days would be crucial. Mark would no doubt come up with a new strategy to protect himself. But Caroline wasn't afraid. She had faced him head-on, and now there was no turning back. The sound of a distant door slamming echoed through the house again, but this time, it wasn't filled with the same weight. It was just noise now, empty, meaningless noise. Caroline smiled to herself as she climbed into bed, pulling the blankets around her. Tomorrow, she would meet with her lawyer, finalize her plans, and prepare for the next phase of her life. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She had come so far, and the end was finally in sight. The media storm surrounding Mark's downfall intensified in the days following the leak. Headlines about his financial misconduct and the pending divorce were everywhere, tarnishing the perfect image he had spent years cultivating. Caroline watched from a distance as Mark scrambled to do damage control, releasing carefully worded statements through his lawyer and attempting to spin the narrative in his favor. But it wasn't working. The evidence Caroline had provided was too strong, and the media wasn't buying Mark's excuses. His business partners began distancing themselves from him, and some of their closest friends quietly withdrew from social gatherings. The world that Mark had built on charm and deceit was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Caroline, meanwhile, found herself in an unusual position. She had been prepared for a fight, for a bitter, drawn-out divorce that would take months, if not years, to resolve. But now, with Mark's reputation in tatters, he was the one trying to negotiate. Her lawyer, Sarah, had called her earlier that morning with an update. Mark's team is offering a much more favorable settlement, she had said. He's trying to close this quietly, hoping to avoid any further damage. Caroline had smiled to herself when she heard the news. Mark had been so sure of himself, so convinced that he would come out of this unscathed. But now, he was the one scrambling to protect what little remained of his empire. She agreed to meet with Mark one last time to finalize the settlement. The meeting was brief, held in a sterile conference room at his lawyer's office. Mark looked different now, tired, defeated. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was tempered by the realization that he had lost. The terms were simple. Caroline would keep a significant portion of their shared assets, including the family home. Mark, desperate to move on and salvage his career, agreed without much resistance. There was no need for further negotiations. It was clear that both of them wanted this to be over. As they signed the final papers, Mark didn't meet her eyes. The man who had once thrived on charm and control was now a shadow of his former self, his arrogance shattered. When the meeting ended, Caroline stood, gathering her things. She glanced at Mark one last time, feeling a strange sense of closure. There was no victory in this, not really, but there was peace. "Goodbye, Mark," she said quietly, her voice steady. He didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. Caroline walked out of the office, her footsteps light as she stepped into the bright afternoon sun. The war was over, and she had emerged on her own terms. For the first time in years, she felt free. The house was quiet as Caroline sat by the large window in the living room, watching the sun set over the garden. The divorce was final, the settlement signed. The house was hers now, and so was her life. The weight of years of control, manipulation, and public facade had finally lifted. Caroline had spent the last few days in quiet reflection, letting the reality of her new life settle in. There was still much to do, legal matters to finalize, personal affairs to sort through. But the hardest part was behind her. She had faced Mark, faced the lies he had built their life on, and she had come out stronger. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the stillness of the evening. It was a message from Diane. "Dinner tomorrow? We need to celebrate." Caroline smiled and typed back a quick reply. "Absolutely. It's about time." For so long, Caroline had lived in Mark's shadow, her life dictated by his ambitions and desires. But now, with the divorce finalized and his control over her life severed, she could finally start thinking about what she wanted. She had always been good at taking care of others. Now, it was time to take care of herself. She stood and walked to the garden, stepping outside into the cool evening air. The flowers she had planted earlier in the spring were blooming, their vibrant colors standing out against the darkening sky. For years, this garden had been her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the suffocating expectations of her marriage. Now, it was a symbol of her new beginning. Caroline took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past slipping away. The future stretched out before her, uncertain but full of possibility. She didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Caroline smiled to herself, feeling a quiet sense of triumph. This was her life now, her story to write, and she was just getting started. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us continue to bring you more captivating stories. What moment had the biggest impact on you? Let us know in the comments below. Was it the intense confrontation, the quiet strength of the protagonist, or the final victory? We want to hear from you. If you have any story ideas or themes you'd love to see featured on the channel, drop your suggestions in the comments. Your ideas could inspire our next story. Thanks for being part of our community, and stay tuned for more.